Juan Angel Chávez is a Mexican artist, skateboarder, born in Chihuahua, Mexico, who now lives and works in Chicago. Chavez focuses on sculptures and site-specific installations made of wood, old signage, and found materials. His works explore social engagement practices through materiality and notions of public domain. His most current projects include Marshfield Courts, a community project taking over an abandoned basketball court to build a neighborhood skate park in Mckinley Park, and Building with Fire, a series of works exploring Shou Sugi Ban, the Japanese burning technique for wood preservation, to deepen the concept of material essence and object significance. Chavez has received national recognition for his work and has been exhibited in local, national, and international venues. He has been recognized with several prestigious awards, the Richard H. Driehaus Individual Artist Award and the Louis Comfort Tiffany Award, an Artadia Individual Artist Award, the Joan Mitchell Individual Artist Award, as well as awards from the Illinois Arts Council and 3 Arts. Let's all welcome our distinguished guest, Juan Angel Chávez, to the stage.
Hello. Thank you for having me, and thank you for saying that I'm distinguished. I didn't realize that that was part of my, I guess I'm getting to be distinguished. Well, thank you for having me. Thank SBA for having me, and thank you, Heather and Duncan, for giving me the opportunity. Glad to be here. Today, I want to show a series of works that revolve around the idea and the concept of misbehaving. And I don't mean misbehaving as a terrible thing. Misbehaving is being a good thing, right? I find that there is a connection between misbehaving, impulsive actions, and creativity that are very well linked and connected to each other. But first, I talk a lot. I don't talk a lot, but in this particular case, in the bio, I mentioned that where I'm from, and it's important for me to talk about where I'm from because that is sort of where I initially start thinking about the notion of misbehaving. Right? It's a connection to the space. It's a connection to site. It's a connection to your environment, and it's within that connection to the environment that I find that is important. It's an important place for you to start creating. And for me, that is an important place. What I've learned from where I'm from, I learned that there is no limitations and everything could be made with your own hands. Resourcefulness, creativity, perseverance. And with that, it creates an ideal that kind of unifies sort of all. And with that, I think is where the nature of misbehaving comes from, because it's the notion that I can do it if you can do it too. That you can always negotiate rules and regulations. You can always negotiate space and permissions, right? So with that, let me start by showing a few images and start talking directly about those images. These are the work that I'm going to show today. It's actually, a lot of it is older work. None of it is newer work, with the exception of one project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to be and start thinking about art, because art was not necessarily in the forefront of my career at the beginning. Something that sort of like landed on my lap later on in life. My aspirations, right, when I was younger, even when I was going to art school, was not to become an artist. My aspirations were to become a professional skateboarder. Shit, that didn't work out. Let's start with a portrait of my home and a portrait of where I'm from. And I think this is really descriptive of sort of how I perceive that space now and my connections to that space. It's always very abstract and very real, and the reality and abstraction, they like sort of like fit within each other. I come from a very rural place, extremely open, big skies, mountains, and rail yards, right? This is sort of like what taught me how to be free, what taught me how to not have limitations in my thoughts or my ideas, to really think about, a relationship within space and my landscape, my environment. But as it was me, I always sort of abstracted. So this is not a modified photograph. This is the train tracks and the mountain that you can always see in my background. So this is where I started with art. Any of you familiar with this image? A lot of you are familiar with this image, right? Because it's right around the corner. This is a work that I did in a past life. This is what I work that I've done when I consider my schooling, right? I'm partly art educated and partly street educated. I went to SAIC. I never graduated. In fact, I was asked to leave the school, but that's a topic for another discussion. When that happened, I ended up getting hooked up with the Chicago Public Art Group because there were people who were involved in the Chicago Public that I knew when I was a teenager. And they sort of wrote me in, and I learned a lot through art, through these community-based processes. So thank you for that. So this is actually one of almost my last murals that I did in the city of Chicago. Right. I left throughout the city. I left a legacy of projects in every neighborhood that you can think of in the city, right? From mural paintings to mosaics, right? Scales of many different sizes. But within that, right, it came this rebellion within myself that this was not what I wanted to do with my art, that this was not what I was interested in at the end, that I was interested in one particular thing, and that was the idea of the connection that I had to those communities and the connection I had to the people that I was working with throughout those communities. So my work changed drastically from this to that. So this piece I love, and actually when I came here, I stopped in and checked up on it, and it's full of dust right now. But this was a project that was a very long-term project. It started at the change of the millennium, with the turn of the millennium, so started in 1999. It was not installed until 2003. When this project was created, I was really interested in sort of like the manifestation of how to manipulate clay, because it was the first time I ever worked with it in this scale. So this is a really ceramic piece, and you've seen it, so I don't need to talk too much about it. But when I was getting really, when I say that I was not really following and engaging myself in this process, is because something else was happening. And that thing was happening. I started identifying things in spaces and sites in all the neighborhoods that I was going to as potential sites for intervention. And the first projects, right, came from visiting this neighbor of mine who was homeless. Well, he wasn't homeless. He was living in an abandoned building across the street from me. His name was Jim Shou. And upon his conversations, this was his home, and I used to hang out with him all the time, as much as I could. We became really close friends, and we also became sort of, we learned a lot from each other. It was a great, I consider a collaboration that at the time I dragged in my girlfriend at the time to take photographs and document this whole experience of me meeting him. But I'm not going to show all those images because there's like over 300 images of that interaction. But what I ended up doing is creating a portrait of Jimmy, or Jim Shou, as he'd like to be called, right? And this was sort of like what really started for me to think about, where my artwork was going, that I wasn't really interested in the mural process. I was really interested in that connection of other people and what was happening within the spaces and changing the spaces that existed. They were abandoned, they were free, that no one could tell me like anything about it. I didn't have to ask for permission. So I started identifying the gray space. And that gray space is what really sort of like drove me into creating more works of that nature. So last piece of the mural, and then an attempt to an installation right next to it. This was in 1996. So it was great. I used to be able to paint, but I'm kind of colorblind. So all my paintings, my portraits ended up kind of green toned. So, nothing was as it was. Right. And then I started like within this idea of the gray space, started identifying the liminal spaces. What happens in the city when things get abandoned? What happens in the city when things get deplenished and they're gone? Right. It creates an opportunity in a site. Right. This utilized for not for me to be mischievous, but for other people to be mischievous. Right. This is where like illegal dumps happen. This is where things get abandoned. This is where things get thrown out. Right. Because no one wants to pay those fees to garbage collection and all those things. Right. So I started doing this installations just with balance, and I used to get these beautiful notes on the sculpture that says that I was going to kill somebody, right? Because they're just balanced, they're not mortar in and kind of dangerous, right? But that's the beginning of this. So I'm going to show this kind of quickly, but talk about these projects. So it wasn't until then, as a response to public art and the public art projects that I was doing, that I started creating these things in my home studio. I started creating these sculptures made out of found objects, right, on doors, because they were easy for me to carry in my station wagon, and I can just easily go install them throughout the city. So this is the first one that I did. And it was like a mind opener for me. And I started doing this just for fun. I had no idea. This was like anti-art to me. This was just like, look, this is an abandoned space. If they can put billboards up on that abandoned building, I can put something else in there. And it could be anything, right? So I started exploring what the possibilities of that, what that could be. So I did a whole series of these projects, right? That I approached these projects in multiple different communities and drive around and say, that one's great. And then I started getting like a rush of doing it. I started getting this rush, this energy from it. I'm like, it kind of feels like graffiti, but it's really not graffiti. It kind of feels like this like anti-establishment sort of approach to things. And it's getting like this adrenaline rushes for him. And I kept expanding this process and expanding the duration that it would take me to install something. So this was one of the most successful ones. And there were other ones that were like playing around more within the space and the aesthetics of the site, right? And then I did a whole series of these where I just kept doing it, and it kept changing the urban environment according to how things were happening. And until one day that I got nominated for an artist award. And I was like, what is this? And then I submitted this images for an artist award, and I got the award. And I was like, holy shit, I can make art and get paid for it. And I don't have to do murals. I don't have to do mosaics. I don't have to deal with other people. I can just focus and do these kind of things. And that's when it sparked my creativity into pushing this sort of like direction of work, where I really started identifying what that meant for me and what that meant for me in terms of utilizing this gray space. What does it look like to utilize this gray space? And how can you sort of like manipulate it? So with that, I created a series of projects, right, in collaborations with other artists. This is my doing a collaboration that I did with artists in Philadelphia and artists from here in Philadelphia. We traveled to Philly and created the same interventions there because, where there's this the words escaping my mind, but where there's disenfranchisement, there's always a good place for you to expand on the gray form. This was here in Hyde Park. And then the collaborations happened where I started inviting artists to do this, and we expanded the time, right? So this is a collaboration between 4 artists, maybe more. I don't remember this exactly. Chris Silva, Mike Genovese, myself, Cody Hudson. I don't remember. This was where Chris Upuse and Maya Hayek came and participated on this project as well. It was another one, perhaps, but my mind kind of fades out from that. And from that, we did more collaborations and iterations, taking over street formations, not only walls, but also sidewalks, wherever we could. And Denmark. This is a project that we did in Denmark with some artists there as well. So those collaborations started growing and growing more, right? And this is the project that, with the same venue, right? There was something that was so genuine about creating work to take over the streets and creating work and that will become part of the vernacular of the streets. That was really something that was really genuine and important to me. And it started becoming so important to my collaborators. So in 2005, we decided to do this project called Tragic Beauty, where we collect work material from throughout the city, and then we'll create this environment installation where you can utilize it to sort of engage with art in a different way. So there was a gallery called, so it was the address, and I can't remember that, 2000. It was on Fulton and Damon. No, Fulton and Damon, sorry. right in the corner. So we took over the space and we created this, we divided the space into responsibilities. I created this gigantic boat, the 27-foot boat made out of found objects. And we changed the entire format of how you utilize the space and you participate in it. So there was a collaboration that happened even far beyond the visual arts. We collaborated with the Empty Bottle to create a series of musical events as well within the space. And this was the same collaboration that, Chris Silva, Mike Genovese, Cody Hudson, and myself. Right. So the premise of this exhibition was that we were going to have a series of performances, a series of events within the space. And then at the end of the exhibition, all this work is returned to the streets in a different manner, in a different form. And we transform in public space within the kind of work that we created for the gallery. So this is what I meant, that I started expanding more in that notion of the space and how long it takes to, and push the boundaries, how long it would take to do an installation during the day, right? And all these installations became a lot more involved. They involve at certain points, they're involved with, trucks, generators, tools, and things without any permission whatsoever, right? It leads me to this. So this was my most known sculpture project intervention at the Hyde Park Art Center in 2007. This is when I really started enjoying and started mixing these notions of community engagement, these notions of breaking out what the gray space could be, and what the skate space could be in a larger format, not in the sense just on the physical form or in the physical site, but how it can, an object, teleport and transmit sort of that gray space into a larger format. So through this project, I set out to create a speaker, right? But not in the sense an object that can expand or amplify the sound, but an object that can actually transmit sound and transmit connections. So I'm really interested in this notion that these ripple effects that an object can have, they can transform even the physical space where it's presented, and it can go beyond that through ideas of collaboration and ideas of programming. So within this project, I set up to create, if anybody familiar with the Hyde Park Art Center, you know that this is a huge space. The speaker measured 25 feet wide by 10 feet high by, I think it was like 30 in depth. I can't remember the depth, the exact dimensions, and entirely made out of found materials, right? The first steps of this project was to create the object. And in the creation of the object was to create a series of participatory tasks. And I'm very proud to say that for this project, I had old ladies connected to the Hyde Park Art Center stealing cones for me to alter the sound that would be produced on the wall of the cone. So, and this was a really fun engagement process where people were just going out and, stop in the middle of the street and like snagging a couple of traffic cones for me. It was wonderful. Outside of like me also going around and picking up stuff from all different areas. So in this, unfortunately, the videos are not working. The sound is not working from this video. So there's a couple of videos here that I wanted to show how music and how the participation of sound sort of perform within the space. The other element of this project that was really significant, it was something that I really enjoyed, is that the object itself throughout the time really changed how I looked at space and how I looked at participation and how I looked who was involved. The genuineness of that was created through the participation. Where we created programming. One is a ticketed events where we can get people to come to the Hyde Park Art Center, right? And the other one was vice versa. It's a transformation of the Hyde Park Art Center into a potential space, a community space that was already there, right? But sort of reinforcing this concept that you have open sign-up sheets for programming. You can utilize the speaker as anything you wanted, a practice space, class, reading, right? And that really engaged me in the process of this larger view of the gray space and the potential use of the gray space, right? that it is not a gallery anymore, that is something completely different. It was display, but it was participation and it was engagement. They grew larger than just within the four walls of the space itself. Right? And that idea sort of fizzled down and it started coming up in different ways. So I don't have a good picture of this. This is the best photograph I have of this, of project that I sort of recreated a bunch of times in different forms. And this was to create an illegal bar that can travel around throughout the city at every event possible. And it could be presented with just one bottle of whiskey and a box truck. So I bought a box truck that I can just make a bar and hold a bottle of whiskey, and I can pull up to any loading dock and, sell whiskey for $1. And it wasn't the money that I was after. It was just this really interesting interaction and the idea of being able to create something completely illegal and get away with it and fun. So this is the bar, right? And then the bar has taken multiple different iterations of this. And the trucks have changed. And they have transformed themselves with the same idea that I was really interested in, sort of like, trying to recreate this moments where people can be truly free from any sort of cultural inhibitions. And it was just fun at the end of the day, right? And it has transformed into a musical space and performative space, right? And a DJ space. But let me stop there. There's more iterations of misbehaving in this regard. But within the premise of looking for or transforming space and looking for different ways of participation and creating a connection with communities, right? That's also part of my work, the social engagement practice of my work. I started seeking out opportunities where I can do work that it can expand the notion of that. So some years back, I proposed a project at New Harmony, Indiana, reached out to me if I was interested into coming down there and participate in a visiting artist program. And I don't know if you're familiar with New Harmony, Indiana. It's pretty much at the bottom tip of Indiana, bordering Illinois and Ohio. Kentucky, I think. Sorry. Kentucky. It's the Ohio River. So being down there was really interesting because New Harmony was based as a utopia. It was established as a utopia at the beginning. And that notion of utopia really sort of got my interest in what it would take to establish a utopia and what the stages of utopia could be, right? Being that the first stage of utopia is to sort of like explore. And that was already what I was really interested in, what felt comfortable to me, this idea of exploration. So when I went down there, I proposed a project that would involve processes that were necessary to exploration and processes that were necessary to establish a utopia, but processes that are now leave to leisure. And this dichotomy really became interesting to me. So my proposal was based on the idea of how this place became a utopia, that they had several stages of utopia. One being exploration, two being established utopia by the Rappists, which was a religious group that was coming from Pennsylvania, and that they abandoned it at a certain point, right? And then a new utopia came, right? And it was an industrial revolution utopia that they were going to establish factories and, get people to work and everybody would live in this community. And that failed. And then the third utopia was that they discovered oil within the region. And with that boom of oil, everybody left the town, right? For more affluent metropolitan places, right? And then a bigger boom, the fourth utopia, said everybody came back. And now you have golf carts on the streets and everybody moves around and through that. And they have a visiting artist program. So I got really interested in this program, but it's like a retirement home community, which it is really beautiful and is historical and is great, right? But I got really interested in this and how to create a project with this. So my first and initial proposal was to burn down one of the trapper trapper cabins that were established in the 1700s that they were restored. So we set up to burn this thing and then have a ceremonial burning in front of the Richard Meyer building, because, you know, during the third Utopia, they hired all these famous architects to come down and create this beautiful modernist site as well. So I thought this connection was kind of fun. And the funding was pulled on my project on last minute. So I couldn't burn a cabin using federal funds because we were funded by the NEA. Because we were funded by the NEA and they couldn't burn federal property with federal funds, apparently. So we had to adapt. And this is where this image comes in. We had to adapt as the community sort of like got behind the project and found me a different location, a different site. And I had to adapt myself to burning a barn. And it was really hard. The barns, they're great. There's a lot of history in them. And it was really difficult, right? Barns have, you know, historical significance, not only to agriculture, but also to survivors of wars, right? And they're really loaded information. And this thing is that when I saw it and I went to take a look at it to see if this was going to be proper thing to burn, I didn't want to burn it. I was just like, but we had already set up to burn things. We had to set this thing on fire. So, you know, it was fine. And so we decided to go ahead and burn it, but also because it was a community project that had to think about burning as a community engagement process, right? And that was really captivating because the community engagement process was not making art as we know it. It was burning shit. It was burning barns, right? And that because we were dealing with municipalities and we were dealing with, you know, people, that we had to sort of think about it differently. And to me, that was a way to sort of expand the notion of what is included as art materials. What do we choose as an art practice, right? That there is no rule. That this idea of the gray space, that extended beyond just the physical space, but it extended to materiality and to processes. So I really started thinking, I was like, well, if we're going to burn, let's get as many fire departments to do this thing, because this could be a really cool thing. And then we can have, you know, the whole community can have a giant, you know, bonfire. And that's essentially what happened, right? So setting this thing up was a lot of fun. But it got so big that people had to be pushed back. This wind started picking up and flames started going sideways and extending the direction of our circle, our fun circle. And there was no room, you know, for s'mores or popcorn or anything you wanted to have, just a couple of beers if you wanted to, but that's the extent of this thing. And the idea was that we're going to put it through these processes that built a exploration of things, processes that were necessary to build to establish a society, right? Like this idea of exploration, you need to be able to eat. So that was hunting, right? So, and then it was like, you need to be able to make a fire, right? To cook. So that was like burning the barn. And so, you know, working with this community, I started identifying like, oh, how are we going to shoot things, right? So we're like, well, let's see what we can do. And then the ROTC program at the University of Southern Indiana raised their hand and says, we got you, right? So they came out, and this is like, you know, civilians, most of them. Sorry, the video doesn't work, but So they pull up in pickup trucks to the shooting range, and it was 4 hours of just any weapon you can describe being shot at this thing. And it was fascinating and boring after an hour. But what was really interesting is sort of like what, this idea that, this taboo processes, or specifically shooting, is so taboo that was utilized as an art process. What I was really interested in doing is like this idea of creating this process as there's more considered with leisure now, and the idea of collecting weapons, an idea of leisure that everybody goes hunting is unnecessary, but at the same time is something that is fundamental in a way that is being utilized for an art process. And the result was this installation. There was a combination of the material that was derived through all these processes to create this installation in the gallery, right? It was just a process of the burning and a process of the collection, and then creating an alternative landscape that sort of reflected this whole project. And these are some of the pieces that sort of derived from that. This textures and chainsaw carvings from burning material. And this is something completely different. And this is a great project. This was a collaborative project. And it was a project that I was approached to do a project literally with the concept of misbehaving. So when I was approached to this project, they were like, "We want you to do something that's mischievous." And I was like, "Oh shit, it's not theater, to me. It's a serious thing." And I brought it up to a friend of mine, and I said, "Remember the speakeasy in Philly that we went to, that we spent all morning in, right? I kind of want to recreate that." And he's like, "I'm down. Let's do this. But how are we going to do it?" Because this is a good friend and collaborator, Mike Genovese and I. And we were like, "How are we going to do it?" And it's like, it has to be real. It cannot be fake. It cannot be theater. It cannot be actors. It has to be like the real thing. How are we going to do this? Remember how when we went to that place, what it appeared to be. So there was like this facade, right? That appeared to be just a house, like a regular yellow vinyl house. And then when you walked in, it was fucking for real. It was like, it was 2 bars, 4 stripper poles, right? There was free drugs. It was just crazy. And we were like, we have to sort of recreate that. How do we do it? Right? So like, oh, I know. Let's call up Mike, another friend, who should remain nameless, who was a friend of ours, an art collector and a drug dealer. Right? So we got to get him involved. And he also happened to, be a videographer. He had we were a recording company to record hip hop. And so he's like, I'm totally down. The only thing I want to do, I'm fully funded. The only thing I want to do is I want to control the door. I'm like, okay, you control the door. That's fine. And we put this project together where I built the entire inside of this project. I built the stage. I built the seating, the DJ booth. And Mike will work on all the recording. We had to record everything. Everything had to be recorded. He set up GoPro cameras throughout the entire project, through the entire space, right? And he hired security, so no one can get in. It was up to the discretion of the bouncer, whether you got in or not. And it has specific rules that if you look like an artist or an art patron, you are not allowed in at all. So the only reason this is a different project is because this project, all the GoPro cameras did not work. And this was the only photograph that exists of this project, where this process of misbehaving, there was a whole event happening surrounding this project. This was the real thing. We had collaborated with Hornswallowers, which with this these two guys who used to go to different events and make an alcoholic drink for each event. So they created a drink just for this project. Mike took care of all the other psychedelic essentials for this project, and we had a great time, and it was a great experience. And he was truly misbehaving, and unfortunately, we don't have any documentation of this. Oh yes, the part of the programming also involved a friend of mine was doing a project where he was documenting young trans Puerto Rican kids, and he told them about the project, and they came, and there were, as you can see, the two people on the side, and then the middle person in the pole, that was actually a stripper that the event hired to do their misbehaving somewhere else, but she abandoned that and came into here and sort of like hung out with us the entire night. So it's I love this project, but it's really hard to talk about without visuals, because it's just sort of like, became this thing that it lives. It's not Sequoia. And it lives within this idea of memory, and this idea of space and word of mouth, right? And I really appreciate that more now than the documentation. That I can say that I did this project, that it was like that I try to recreate reality somewhere else. That a reality that exists in another place, I tried to recreate it, but I didn't want to do theater, right? So I'm going to show a bunch of projects that are going to lead now to sort of my most current project. So this is a series of projects where I chose installations and sculptures that sort of like blur the line of this idea of the gray space and the invisible lines and this kind of thing, right? So this is a project that I did for Chicago Idea Week, maybe 10 years ago, where I wanted to create an object that could exist in two times, right? One during the day, one during the night. One during the day that it can illustrate sort of like passages of people walking back and forth within the site. And at night, create this other opportunity that for this other activity that are really close to me, right? This other activity that illustrates sort of like this connection between body and physical space, and that is skateboarding, right? So I figured that I would do this project that it looks like a sculpture, but it's actually something you can skate, right? And then we created this whole series of events that, if you went downtown where the Apple store is, that you can come and skate at any time. And this is a place where you won't be chased by security, although they would chase you because they thought it was art and you couldn't hang out in art. So yeah. Then I did all the projects that sort of blur the line, like, this different invisible ideas. I did a project based on sort of hiding your identity, or appearing to be something that you're not, sort of, so you can full authority, or you can pass the line, right? And this was a reaction to one of my trips back home and seeing how everyday life was affected through war and the war between cartels, right? That everybody in that area had to perceive to be somebody who they're not, had to change their manner of speaking, change their behavior on a daily basis, and not in a drastic way, but in a real subtle way, right? Like subtle way, like you couldn't honk the horn at somebody because you didn't know what you were going to get, reaction you were going to get, right? You had to appear to be someone that only lives between 7 a.m. and 9 o'clock at night, that there was no life behind that, right? So it really sort of like, not traumatized, but maybe really think about in a place that I grew up in that is so free, right? Without regulations, that I could leave, when I was 2 years old and walk off into, past the train tracks and freak out my mom. Like that kind of place, that tranquility of that open space was also like compromised. So that I had to perform to be somebody else. So I set out to do this project where I wanted to restrict the viewer from knowing or having a preconceived idea of what the project was going to be. And then I was to control the entrance of the space, fully control the entrance of the space, and create the sculpture that can go directly to the door, right? And hide the door itself. So you wouldn't be able to see that we were forced to travel through this tunnel, right? And once you were in the gallery, you were able to perceive what the sculpture was about. And it was really just this idea of a log, kind of like in cartoons, like when the predator is trying to catch the rabbit and he goes in there and then it's like goes in one side, it goes out the other. And there's this game, right? But, to my lack of knowledge, I didn't realize you couldn't block a whole entrance, right? Not the city, but the fire department doesn't allow you to block entrances. But I tried. I really did, right? And then for this project, it was another element, and I didn't bring that image where I hire a friend of mine to check ID and identification as you came in as part of the work. So then other projects, that this was created out of, extending this idea of like the gray space to materiality. I started thinking about when I was approached by this institution to create this project, that I wanted to create something literally from a dump site. So I drove around and picked a dump site that had enough material to make this installation, right? And it really truly was that. It was like this idea of connecting I titled this piece, No Shoes, No Shirt, No Service, right? Because it was this idea of like the discarded, the unwanted, and the undesirable. And really thinking about what that material is. And it was just a project where I could just have fun in creating an installation, right? That could involve, all these materials that were made from trash. Oh, I'm almost there. How am I doing on time? Good? Okay. So yeah. So my latest project, right? And I think Zach's here somewhere. Involves my friend Zach over there, right? And this project also started sort of like in a misbehaving way. I was approached by Vice Media some years ago. It's been 5 years, Zach? About 5, 6 years? Yeah. I was approached because they were doing a documentary, and a documentary on artists across the country who are changing things, right? And they approached me and I was like, you have a project, we'd love to document in this project. I was like, I don't have a project, right? But I can make one up for you real quick. And this is where this project started, right? So I said, yeah, this is abandoned basketball courts down the alley from my house. I think it would be a great opportunity to create an event or create something else from this event that can extend itself in multiple different ways. We can start with the idea of just cleaning this place up, right? And immediately I said, what better way to transform this abandoned basketball courts, right? They transform it into a skate park, right? Because my idea of the skate park was not necessarily a locals only situation, because that's sort of been like the go-to, or was the go-to when I was coming up skateboarding, that this is our spot and you can't hang in our spot. Only if you become friends with us, you can be in our spot. And I kind of just really didn't appreciate that about it. So I started like looking for opportunities to be able to create a space that it could be all inclusive in a lot of ways. So I said, what better opportunity than to create a skate park, out of this abandoned basketball courts? And immediately they said, let's do it, right? So we started the planning process and then discovered that they were too chicken shit to do it illegally. So we had to get permission. But permission was not easy to get. The site is this. And this site has a little bit of history with the city of Chicago, right? There was a time where all these little city parks that existed throughout, in different neighborhoods, they were broken down into city property and park district property. If they were under a certain square footage, they became part of the city. If they were over the square footage, became part of the park district. So within that gray space, right, of the city ownership of the spaces, this site was abandoned for 30-something years. The only reason we found out that it was city is because we had to get permission for filming, not permission for building. And the city came back at me and said, well, if you want to use it, you need to sign a right of entry contract, which I said, I don't want to, but I'll do it. I said, I'll do it if only it's like for a determined amount of time. So I signed the contract for 6 months. And what those contracts outline is that I'm responsible for anything that happens within that space, which scared the shit out of me for 6 months, right? But nevertheless, I said, screw it. We'll let the contract run out. Let's do what the city allows us to do it, and then think about the next steps. So the first steps were, this was my proposal. I said, I'll paint everything. Floor, walls, fences, all these other things, and I'll create the space, transform it visually. They told me no, because paint cannot be used to paint old concrete that's been abandoned for 30 years. That it only had to be chalk paint. I said, what's the point of that? Right? So I painted it in the manner that the city, as we cleaned it up, painted it, how the city asked me to. This is all nice and dandy, right? Then we had this great event. This is a video as well, but I don't think it's going to play. That shows sort of like the community engagement, the processes that were involved to clean this whole thing up. This brought people from the entire community of McKinley Park to clean up this place, participate in the beautification process of this project, right? And then I'm going to go backwards on this. What's going on? The video is trying to play. It's froze. Oh, there. And then some local yokels decided that they were going to make a DIY skate park, because I already had the seeds in there. And they built this terrible ramp that, another member of the crew of the Marshfield Courts is Old Man Mike. And Old Man Mike and I saw this and they were like, absolutely not. This is not, we have standards here. So we decided to sort of bury the ramp that they have created and start building this ramp on top of it, which has led to the creation of not just one ramp, but the real transformation of the site. And the transformation of the site as being a full-on skate park, right? That is a community skate park. Although I was responsible for initiating sort of like this moment, right, to transform this spot. It was also a moment where communities sort of like naturally came together to support it, right? There was not just a beautification place, that is a transformation of a site, right? And that transformation of a site has changed, right, in how the community has been identified, right? We get together on Sundays and build, fabricate, and construct, right, for the benefit of skateboarding and the benefit of the community. It's also being utilized as community garden, right? It's also being utilized as a community event space. We had a 4-year-old birthday party there. It was pretty amazing, right? With tacos and balloons and all the events, right? And, we created the partnerships and collaborations with the neighbors. We don't have any support from the city at all. Everything has been provided by our next door neighbor that gives us water and electricity. The other neighbor first provided with sounds. Involuntarily, he provided music, but he's sort of chill with that now. Narco corridos at the loudest you could, while we're trying to work. And, we have became friends. among over the years, right? So now it's equally respected. And yeah, it's a great place. Now we have Zach's responsible for having mini library there, and now we also have a mini gallery that's constantly rotated with artists. First was artists who skateboard, and now it's artists that he curates into a whole annual change in roster. And we also had skate school where we teach people how to skate, you know, and also break down not only the fabrication process, but also breaking down into the creation and participation of other artists to do collaborations within the work, right? So this is Maria Barandurena this year with their project wrapping the entire fence. And then we had Glenn Goldberg from New York and Emmett Kerrigan here in Chicago do a couple of cutouts to add to the collection of works. Perfect. Mini gallery, mini library, and mini gallery. And the best one. Thank you. Yeah. So one more thing about that project.